The wind moves like an absent footstep, a hollow sound across stone, a bell that no longer rings. Heat on tile, cold in shadow, silence thick as dust. You can hear the house bones. They creak, they settle, tiles slip. A stair exhales its last pebble. A wall tilts and then stops, and as if listening. There is a road that ends in sky. There are terraces that remember plows. There are cisterns that held rain and now hold only light. Pigeons cross empty lintels. Grass grows through thresholds. Frescoes stare at weather. No dogs bark. No oven smoke. No children run. Only the calendar of wind. Only the slow counting down of rain. It didn't collapse overnight. It leaned. Slowly. Footprints stop at a threshold. A bowl sits with a white film of dust. Someone left a shawl over a broken chair. Not a story. A single faithful object. A small proof that a life was here. And beyond the sightline, badlands. Ridges cut like dried skin. The earth below keeps its patient slide. Something like a memory waits at the town's edge. It is neither accusation nor apology. It is a quiet tension. You feel it before you see it. They called it a town at the top of the world. But first, listen. Wind carries a different grammar up here. It speaks in crumbs and shingle. It reads the slope like a page. The place sits where a ridge meets a sky that never forgives. It hangs above a valley, a long carved throat of earth. The river at the bottom keeps a slow, indifferent rhythm. This is southern Italy. This is Basilicata. A rough inward country, sparse and patient. The town itself, the name is small and stubborn, is Craco. You find it by losing the road. You find it by climbing through gullies called calanchi, the land's torn skin. The houses cling like sentences written in stone. Below, the valley of the Cavone River folds away. Below that, the town of Matera rides its own ridges, and a neighbor in name, not in fate. The geography is honest. A wedge of sand and conglomerate sits on top of a bed of varicolored clay. Rain collects where tile used to catch it. Cisterns that once held life now leak into the slope. Seismic plates breathe through the hills. The earth has reasons for moving. They are not dramatic, just material. There is a small mystery here that no legend can change. How does a living place turn into a ruin without fire? Without war, without an edict from a conqueror? How does the land itself become the slow decision that tells people to carry their kitchens away? You can stand on the ridge and see the answer the earth gives you. You see erosion gullies like open veins. You see walls that do not meet foundations. You see a town framed by the steady geometry of decline. But listen again. The town's disappearance was not a single scream. It was a long, measured unburdening. It was the sound of wells going dry, of emigration tickets stamped and mailed, of roofs that first cracked and then surrendered. Now the question waits, not a mystery for detectives, a question for the weather and for statutes of stone. Why did people insist on staying so long? Why did they leave at last so quietly? You will learn the answers in the stones, and in the ledger lines of rainfall, and in the slack rope of a retaining wall. The ridge was not chosen by accident. Long before the houses, before the bell tower, before the name settled into its present shape, people were already burying their dead here. Archaeologists found tombs dating back to the 8th century BCE on the surrounding slopes. The hill was visible, defensible, dry, a place where the horizon could be watched. Centuries later, sometime around 540 CE, Greek monks fled inland from the malaria-ridden coast near Metaponto. They moved away from the marshes and established a small monastic presence on this high ground then known as Montedoro. It was not yet a town. It was a refuge. The modern name traces back to a Latin word, graculum, meaning a small plowed field. In 1060, Archbishop Arnaldo of Tricarico granted the land formally to a Norman lord. That act is one of the first recorded anchors in the town's documented history. The hill was no longer just a refuge. It was a feudal holding. By the mid-12th century, a Norman noble named Uberto fortified the summit. Stone replaced timber. Walls rose along the narrow crest. A defensive tower marked the highest point. Craco entered the written record as a structured settlement, not simply a rural outpost. In 1179, Roberto di Pietrapertosa inherited the lordship. Feudal control tied the town to wider power, networks that stretched across southern Italy. Over the next 2 centuries, authority shifted, from Norman to Swabian rule under Frederick II, then to the French Angevin after 1266, and later to the Aragonese crown. The hill did not move. The flags did. Under Frederick II in the early 13th century, the fortress tower gained strategic relevance. The emperor reorganized southern Italy into a network of fortified administrative points. Craco's elevation made it suitable as a military outpost and holding center. The tower that still stands, now skeletal and hollow, was once part of that system. By 1276, Craco had an organized università, a medieval civic body responsible for local administration. It was not a university in the modern sense, but it signaled structured governance. There were defined public spaces. By 1300, 4 piazzas existed within the ridge's narrow confines. Palaces began to rise around them. Religious architecture followed power. The Chiesa Madre di San Nicola became the town's spiritual center, built and modified between the 13th and 17th centuries. It featured a domed structure and a tripartite bell tower visible from the valley floor. Frescoes in the Neapolitan style once colored its interior walls. The Franciscan convent of San Pietro, established in the 17th century, anchored the northern end of the ridge. Religious life was not ornamental here. It structured time itself. Feudal families shaped the town's architecture. The Grossi, the Carboni, the Camerota, the Murana, the Simonetti, the Rigironi. Their palaces were built in sandstone and conglomerate blocks quarried nearby. Stone portals carried coats of arms. Narrow streets wrapped around private courtyards. Status was visible in masonry thickness and balcony placement. Craco's population peaked in 1561 at approximately 2,590 inhabitants. For a ridge settlement in Basilicata, that number signaled regional importance. Grain fields in the valley below sustained it. The coat of arms, an arm clutching 3 sheaves of wheat, was not symbolic flourish. Wheat was survival. But feudal prosperity was never evenly distributed. Large landowners controlled the arable fields. Peasant families worked small plots or served as sharecroppers. Grain yields fluctuated with rainfall. Thin soils and erosion limited expansion. Livestock remained modest, and goats, sheep, some cattle. Olive groves and vineyards added stability but not wealth. The town's social structure reflected hierarchy. Noble families occupied the higher elevations near the fortress. Clergy held authority over records, schooling, and ritual. Most villagers were agricultural laborers. Literacy remained limited well into the 19th century. Parish registers documented births, marriages, and deaths. The church functioned as both archive and authority. Epidemics cut through the population more than once. The plague of 1656 reduced numbers sharply. Recovery was slow. Yet the ridge remained inhabited. Generations layered stone upon stone. Under Spanish Bourbon rule in the 17th and 18th centuries, Craco remained tied to the Kingdom of Naples. Taxes were levied. Feudal obligations persisted. There were no grand reforms here, just continuity. In 1799, during the turbulence inspired by the French Revolution, a local figure named Innocenzo de Cesare briefly declared Craco self-governing. The experiment did not last. Bourbon authority returned, but it marked something important. The town was not passive. It responded to broader political tremors. After Italian unification in 1861, Craco became part of the Kingdom of Italy. Brigandage spread across Basilicata in the 1860s as rural populations resisted new taxation and military conscription. The terrain around Craco, steep, cut by gullies, provided both refuge and obstacle. But by then, the fortress tower no longer served defense. It had become a landmark. By the late 19th century, economic strain intensified. Between 1892 and 1922, more than 1,500 residents emigrated, primarily to the United States and South America. Census figures dropped. Families sold land to fund passage. Letters returned with American stamps and foreign currency. The ridge held fewer voices each year. Yet even in decline, daily life continued in rhythm. Rainwater collected in rooftop cisterns. Bread ovens fired at dawn. Wheat was threshed in shared yards. Religious festivals structured the calendar. San Nicola in August, Madonna della Stella in May. Processions wound through narrow streets, carrying statues, polished by generations of hands. The town did not yet know it was fragile. Its foundations were already compromised and sandy, conglomerates resting on unstable clay. But the cracks were not yet catastrophic. The instability beneath the slope remained a geological fact, not daily fear. The real fracture had not arrived, but it was waiting. The first warnings did not look like disaster. They looked like inconvenience. In 1954, heavy storms tore through the valley below the ridge. A newly built football field, modest, recently leveled ground meant for boys and weekend matches, was destroyed when the saturated earth gave way. It seemed isolated, repairable, but it was the first visible sign that the slope was shifting under modern weight. 5 years later, in 1959, violent rainstorms struck again. This time, the retaining wall below the historic center fractured. The clay beneath, swollen with water, began to move. Cracks opened in houses along the lower edge of town. Floors tilted, plaster split, doors no longer closed cleanly. The slope was not collapsing in spectacle. It was slipping in increments. Engineers began to observe a pattern. Craco sat atop a wedge of sandy conglomerate, layered over deep formations of varicolored clay, the Argil variegate. The clay absorbed water and expanded. When saturated, it lost cohesion. The upper layer, where the houses stood, had no solid anchor beneath it. In the early 1960s, the situation accelerated. In December 1963, after persistent rainfall, new fissures opened across streets. In January 1964 and again in January 1965, sections of the slope reactivated. Groundwater pressure increased. A recently constructed aqueduct, intended to modernize the town's water supply, had redirected flow patterns. Old rooftop cisterns, once used to capture and contain rain, fell into disuse. Water that had been managed now seeped directly into vulnerable layers. On the ridge, people began to hear changes. Floors creaked differently. Stone dust collected on windowsills overnight. Walls bowed subtly. Town engineer Luigi Papaleo documented what he saw. In 1964, he wrote that the phenomenon had reached such an advanced stage as to exclude any possibility of restoring the slope. He recommended gradual relocation. His words were technical. His conclusion was not. In 1965, a major landslide tore through the frontal portion of the village. 153 houses were damaged or destroyed. The main access road cracked vertically. One side of the retaining wall sank nearly 2 meters. Entire facades separated from foundations. Families moved furniture into neighboring homes, then into temporary shelters. Then downhill. Relocation began that year in earnest. Authorities designated a safer site in the Salandrella Cavone Valley below. The new settlement would be called Craco Peschiera. It was not framed as abandonment yet. It was described as precaution. Some residents resisted at first, not out of denial but attachment. Fields still produced wheat. Olive trees still fruited. Church bells still rang. But the movement beneath their feet did not pause. Between 1969 and 1971, after funds were spent, constructing a new retaining wall, intended to stabilize the slope, 2 significant landslides undermined the intervention itself. One slide cut beneath Via Garibaldi. Another destabilized the area near the Chiesa Madre di San Nicola. Structures that had survived earlier events now fractured. By 1972, most of the upper town stood empty. Only a handful of elderly residents remained in partially intact homes. They had watched the population decline long before geology forced their departure. Emigration had already hollowed the town. Now the earth finished what economics had begun. In 1979, intense rains reopened old fissures. Engineers monitored the cracks but offered no new solutions. The geology was clear: shallow slides triggered by seasonal rainfall, deeper mass movements activated by prolonged saturation. Drainage trenches and piles did little to counteract the underlying clay instability. Then on November 23, 1980, the Irpinia earthquake struck southern Italy. The magnitude approached 6.9, though. Its epicenter lay elsewhere. In the southern Apennines, the shock waves traveled through Basilicata. In Craco, weakened walls shook violently. Already fractured structures lost cohesion. Steps collapsed. Cornices fell into streets that no one swept anymore. After the earthquake, provincial civil protection authorities declared the old town unsafe for habitation. There was no debate left. The final families left quietly. They packed what remained in heirlooms, church objects, livestock. Municipal offices had already moved. Statues and relics were transferred to the new village. The last church service in San Nicola took place in late 1980. By early 1981, Cracovecchia stood empty. No flames, no siege, no official ceremony, just gravity, water, time. The collapse had taken decades, not dramatic. not sudden, measured in millimeters, recorded in rain gauges, confirmed by seismographs. The ridge that once protected the town had become the mechanism of its removal. Long before the landslides, another departure had already begun. It did not announce itself with cracks in walls. It came with envelopes, with ship manifests, with names written in ink that smudged in the Atlantic air. By the late 19th century, Craco's population had stabilized at roughly 500 to 1,800 people. That number masked a quiet strain. Land was finite. Wheat yields depended on rainfall that arrived unevenly. Erosion reduced usable soil. Wealth concentrated in a few families. For younger men, inheritance meant division, and division meant insufficiency. In 1871, the population stood near 900. By 1911, it had fallen to around 1,359. Between 1892 and 1922, more than 1,500 residents left for the Americas. Most traveled to the United States, New York, Philadelphia, industrial cities where factory work replaced field labor. Others went to Argentina and Brazil. Passage was often financed by relatives who had already left. Entire family lines shifted continents within a generation. This was not unique to Craco. It was part of a broader southern Italian exodus. But for a ridge town dependent on agricultural density, the impact was sharp. Labor declined. Fields went untended. Stone houses inherited by distant relatives stood locked. Remittances returned. Small sums folded into letters. They paid debts. They repaired roofs. They funded marriages. But they did not reverse the demographic trend. By the early 20th century, the town was already thinner. Festivals continued. Wheat was still harvested, but classrooms had fewer children. After World War II, migration resumed, though in smaller waves. Northern Italy, France, Belgium. Industrial economies absorbed younger Cracisi. Those who remained were older, rooted, cautious. In 1961, census records showed 1,871 residents. The number appears stable, even healthy, but it included families already preparing to leave. Families splitting between hill and valley, families uncertain whether to invest in repairs. When the landslides intensified in the 1960s, relocation to Craco Peschiera accelerated what emigration had started. The move downhill was organized but emotional. Municipal workers helped transport furniture. Livestock was led along the new access road. Kitchen cabinets were dismantled. Windows removed. Religious statues carried carefully. Engineer Luigi Papaleo had warned of inevitable collapse. Mayor Antonio Riccioli later described the evacuation with restraint, leaving with grief, but choosing life over stone. By 1972, most upper streets were deserted. Only a few elderly residents refused at first. They remained in partially intact houses, aware of the risk. They had already watched children and grandchildren depart for foreign countries. Leaving the ridge meant severing the final visible thread to ancestry. The earthquake of 1980 ended that resistance. After November 23rd, civil authorities enforced complete evacuation. Services moved entirely to the valley. The old town was sealed. Craco Peschiera, the new settlement, offered modern infrastructure, planned streets, reinforced buildings, municipal offices, a church. It was safer, but it was not the ridge. The old Palazzo Comunale was dismantled where possible. Some architectural elements were reused. Most structures were left as they stood, roofless, fractured, open to weather. The abandonment was administrative. It was procedural. It involved paperwork. But for those who carried their belongings down the slope, it was also final. No one would sleep under the Norman Tower again. No bread would bake in those ovens. No cistern would fill from those rooftops. The population collapse of Craco was not a single event. It was layered. First, the young left for ships. Then the middle-aged left for safety. Finally, the elderly left because they had no choice. By the early 1980s, Cracovecchia had become uninhabited terrain, classified as unsafe, marked as red zone, structurally compromised. The town did not die in a single year. It thinned, it fractured, it emptied, and then it stayed that way. For a while, the town remained suspended between ruin and memory. After 1981, no one lived in Cracovecchia, but it did not disappear. The walls stood, the tower held, the dome of San Nicola remained visible from the valley floor. Cracked, roofless but upright. Engineers classified most of the upper town as structurally unstable. The clay substrata continued to shift with seasonal rainfall. Rockfalls were common. Entire staircases led nowhere. Streets ended in voids where the slope had peeled away, yet the architecture endured an outline. The Norman tower, square, severe, became the most recognizable silhouette. The Chiesa Madre di San Nicola, stripped of its roof, revealed fragments of frescoes exposed directly to sky. The convent of San Pietro, sturdier in construction, remained one of the more intact structures. No reconstruction campaign followed. There was no state-funded restoration. Instead, the approach became containment. In the 1990s and early 2000s, stabilization measures were installed in limited areas. Steel tie rods anchored walls. Protective nets caught falling debris. Concrete supports reinforced select facades. These were not attempts to rebuild. They were attempts to prevent collapse into the valley below. Ownership of the old town remained largely public under the commune of Craco, with portions under Italian cultural heritage protection. Access was restricted. Most buildings were designated red zone, unenterable except for maintenance. But something unexpected happened. Filmmakers arrived. The visual isolation, the ridge, the badlands, the preserved medieval layout, offered a setting difficult to replicate elsewhere. In 1979, Francesco Rossi had filmed scenes for Christ Stopped at Eboli nearby. In 2004, Mel Gibson used the abandoned streets for The Passion of the Christ. Later came scenes for Quantum of Solace in 2008 and Basilicata Coast to Coast in 2010. The camera moved where residents once had. Actors stood in doorways that no longer had doors. The town's second life began not as habitation but as image. International attention followed. In 2010, Craco Vecchia was placed on the World Monuments Fund watch list. Listing did not promise reconstruction. It signaled vulnerability and importance. Funding supported further safety measures and controlled visitor access. By 2011 and 2012, guided tours were formally established. Visitors entered only in small groups. Helmets were required. Routes were fixed, reinforced with railings and monitored for movement. Craco became a destination defined by absence. There are no souvenir shops in the old streets, no restaurants, no reopened houses. The new village, Craco Peschiera, houses roughly 700 to 750 residents. It functions normally: schools, municipal offices, daily routines. But above it, the old ridge remains untouched except by maintenance crews and guided footsteps. Tourists come for photographs. Architects come for study. Geologists come for data. They walk along Corso Vittorio Emanuele II, tracing the axial path from the former convent to the fortress tower. They pass palaces built by families whose names are still remembered in the valley. Grossi Carbone, Camarota, Maronna Simonetti. Inside the roofless church, light falls differently now. Not filtered through glass. Not colored by candle flame. Rain enters freely. Wind rearranges dust. Craco has not been stabilized into permanence. It is preserved in instability. Monitoring systems track structural shifts. Seasonal inspections assess erosion. Entry remains regulated because the slope remains active. The clay beneath has not stopped absorbing water. The ridge still responds to rainfall. There are proposals, architectural theses, regional discussions, but no large-scale rebuilding plan has been approved. The decision is deliberate. Reconstruction would require deep geotechnical intervention. Expensive and uncertain, preservation in situ is the chosen path. The town exists as controlled ruin. It stands because it is empty. It remains because no one sleeps there. Silence stretches across the ridge. The streets are hollow. The Norman tower casts a shadow over fractured stone. The dome of San Nicola leaks rain directly onto its frescoed interior. Wind whistles through missing roof tiles. Some walls lean, held only by steel braces. Others are gone entirely, swallowed by the clay slope. Visitors tread carefully. Guided groups move in slow procession. Helmets on heads. Cameras clicking. The town is both backdrop and character. In 2004, Mel Gibson's crew arrived. The Passion of the Christ filmed along the axial street. The wind whipping dust around the actors' feet. Later, in 2008, Quantum of Solace placed secret agents in the empty palaces and fractured courtyards. Each production left no trace, yet added layers to the town's narrative. Images burned into screens worldwide. Craco's ghost became cinematic. Its silence became deliberate storytelling. Tourism followed cautiously. By 2009, guided visits were piloted. By 2012, routes were reinforced. Netting installed to catch falling debris. Visitors were limited to small groups. The fragile streets measured against the need for safety. Helmets were mandatory. The town, once a place of daily life, had become a museum of absence. Preservation is practical. Steel tie rods anchor walls. Concrete braces hold leaning palazzi. Retaining nets protect against rockfalls. Archaeologists and engineers assess fissures seasonally. Craco is not rebuilt. It is watched, monitored, managed. The old streets are lined with fragments of memory. Carved stone portals hint at noble families, Grossi, Carbone, Madonna Simonetti. Piles of rocks mark personal tributes left by descendants, offerings to memory, markers of lineage, gestures to keep the ridge alive in human consciousness. Inside San Nicola, fragments of frescoes endure. Inside the Friary of San Pietro, a small emotional museum documents photographs, letters, and memorabilia. The museum tells the story of both departure and survival, and of families who carried their lives down to Peschiera, and of those who emigrated overseas, sending back bread, coins, letters, and memories. The old town is dangerous. Access is controlled. Sections remain red zone, closed except for maintenance. The slope remains alive underfoot. Landslides can occur without warning. Yet Craco continues to draw people. Architects study the linear hilltop structure. Geologists measure soil creep. Historians trace the feudal lineage. Tourists climb the steep access paths, cameras raised, stepping cautiously over fractured streets once alive with the sound of carts, livestock, and children's voices. Craco endures in a suspended state, not fully alive, not fully dead. Its stones hold stories, its walls whisper history, its empty streets frame absence as presence. It is a town preserved in fragility, a ghost watched by time, wind, and memory. Time stretches differently over Craco. It is measured not in days but in erosion, not in births but in absence. The ridge is a lens. From it you see the valley below where Craco Peschiera thrives. Children running along paved streets, church bells ringing, markets alive with exchange. Up here the hilltop is still, but it hums with the echo of what once was. There is a strange intimacy and abandonment. You can imagine families moving furniture down the slope. A grandmother, adjusting a shawl over a broken wall as if tucking the stone itself to sleep. Children clutching pet goats as they descend, frightened by a fissure that suddenly opened in the street. Priests blessing empty houses, doors swinging on warped hinges, voices carried faintly on the wind. The town is a testament to patience and gravity. Craco was not destroyed by fire or war. It was withdrawn slowly, meticulously by nature and circumstance. Clay and rain, seismic tremors, and human decisions intertwined to guide its people down the slope, away from the ridge that had once protected them. Visitors now leave offerings, small piles of stones, bread, wine, traces of memory on the streets. The Norman Tower remains the strongest silhouette, unyielding in its presence, silent witness to centuries. Roofless churches let rain illuminate faded frescoes, a private cathedral for the sky. Time in Craco is reflective, not a monument of triumph or failure. It is observation. You can stand at the edge of a collapsed, retaining wall and sense both the persistence of stone and the inevitability of erosion. You can see terraces that once held wheat, still etched in the clay, their rhythm readable across decades. The people who once called this place home are scattered, descendants in northern Europe, the Americas, the valley below. Their memories tethered here, their stories carried in letters, archives, and ritual. The town remains a vessel for these lives, a place that honors absence as much as presence. Craco does not instruct. It does not demand. It allows, it waits, and in that waiting it speaks. A ridge suspended between earth and sky, a memory carved into clay and stone, a silence that listens. The wind moves differently here. It shifts over fractured stone and collapsed rooftops. It whispers through empty windows, down streets that no one walks, into courtyards that hold no laughter. Craco is not a town anymore. It is a question about what we leave behind, about the weight of generations on fragile ground, about the choices we make when the earth itself demands we move. How much of our lives will be remembered? What stories will survive the silence? Which walls will outlast us? Which voices will vanish with the wind? And when everything falls away, what will you carry with you? Craco waits, patient, unjudging, suspended between what was and what will never be again. Step carefully. Listen closely. Carry these stories forward. If Craco's echoes stayed with you, if these silent streets moved something in you, subscribe now. And join us as we uncover more lost towns, forgotten lives, and the histories that refuse to be erased. The town endures in memory. It endures in silence. It endures in us.